drinking establishments. But again, Wyoming was the last state in this region to adopt prohibition. The residents in the towns on the borders were particularly fond of the fact that Utah and Montana and Idaho and South Dakota and Nebraska and Colorado all had adopted prohibition by 1915. They were just delighted with that, because there would be these crowds of people that would come into these nearby towns. Cody, for instance, thrived on all the Montanans that would come in for a drink, for coming in from Billings and Red Lodge and all those towns in Montana, because once Montana was dry, hey, Wyoming is wide open. The big parties were in places like Evanston too, where Becker Brewery out of Salt Lake City moved their entire operations to Evanston because they could still legally manufacture and sell more than well, they sold beer, but they could sell anything else in Wyoming, because up until 1919 there was no prohibition law in Wyoming. Torrington was one exception, because Platte County and Goshen County tended to be populated by an awful lot of people who were favorable to temperance, and that's the one part of the state of Wyoming where prohibition remained popular even to the very end of the prohibition era, even to 1932, 31, 32, and 33. In those two counties, prohibition was still popular, and I don't know how to account for that, because that population there doesn't seem to be too much different than the rest of Wyoming, but for reasons that I'm not really clear on, those are the two counties where prohibition was very popular. Now, there probably isn't any correlation here, but also in 1932, the Communist Party ran candidates for statewide office, and you'll never believe where those candidates came from. Yes, Platte County and Goshen County. So I'm not going to make any correlations. You just can't hardly do that. But it is sort of unusual that you would have those sorts of things happen. I think it actually has to do more with the churches in those towns that prohibition was so popular. But I don't think it was the communists. I think those guys were probably affiliated with Sunrise Mines, perhaps, or one way or another involved in radical union activity before coming to Wyoming. But that's the source of another article that Carl Hallberg at the State Archives is in the course of writing right now. But anyway, getting into prohibition. Prohibition had a really terrible beginning in Wyoming. And the reason I say that is that, first of all, it came on the ballot in 1918, in November of 1918, when the young male population of Wyoming was mostly over fighting the war in Europe. Now, there had been efforts at trying to pass a prohibition law prior to 1918, and they had failed in Wyoming. But suddenly, it became very popular and passed with an overwhelming majority in that general election of 1918. Wyoming political figures tended to change their minds on the subject too during those years right after 1916. Suddenly people who had been very skeptical of the whole notion of regulating alcohol, like Joseph M. Carey, suddenly came over to the side of prohibition. So did his son, who was elected governor in 1916. So was John B. Kendrick, who had not been favorable to prohibition prior to that. After all, he was a cowboy on the Texas Trail. Had come up to Wyoming and worked on ranches in the Powder River country, and as you know, eventually settled in Sheridan and became a political force, governor first, and then off to the U.S. Senate. but he changed his mind. There's some really interesting materials in the latter State Archives collection about a group known as the Anti-Saloon League that had very spotty support in most of the state, but down in Cheyenne they had a very active chapter. And there is one person listed as the Secretary-Treasurer of the Anti-Saloon League, whose name was William Ross. William Ross, whose widow, after he was governor and died in office, his widow Nellie Taylor Ross, of course, became the first woman governor of any state. And so he was a very, very staunch supporter of the anti-saloon movement and a very staunch supporter of Prohibition. And so when Prohibition started in Wyoming, it took effect after, they say, the biggest party in Cheyenne's history was on the 30th of June of 1919. And soon after, the state of Wyoming had, by legislation, established this agency that was going to enforce Prohibition in Wyoming. And it was called the Department of Law Enforcement. And one of the things that I argue in a piece that I've done recently is that for all of the bad aspects of Prohibition that failed, there is probably just one thing that Prohibition established that was more or less worthwhile. And that was the professionalization of a statewide law enforcement agency that would provide, for the first time, coordination between sheriffs and local police departments. Because prior to the establishment of the Department of Law Enforcement, with the exception of the U.S. Marshal, whose duties were very restricted to federal law, there was no statewide law enforcement in Wyoming. And it was essentially up to the county sheriffs as to how they were going to enforce the law in their jurisdictions. It was essentially up to the local police departments whether or not to enforce various laws. And for the first time, this Department of Law Enforcement, even though their duties were to enforce the Prohibition laws, still, they provided for the first time some coordination, some coordinated law enforcement in Wyoming. Now that's all the serious academic stuff. Now I can tell some of the stories. So I had to get that